We appreciate the hospitality of the Macomb Community College in hosting the Macomb County Bar Foundation's third annual historical mock trial. Would everyone please rise and join me in saying the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, folks. Please be seated. The Macomb County Bar Foundation is a charitable nonprofit organization established by the Macomb County Bar Association to provide support for civic and law-related educational programming. The foundation does not take a position on the subject of today's debate. Good morning, Senators. That's right. Each and every one of you in the audience is a participating member of the United States Senate today. Besides listening to the arguments provided by both sides carefully, we will ask you to vote at the end of this hearing. The issue before the Senate today is a proposed amendment to the U.S. Constitution to effectively abolish the Electoral College and replace it with a national popular vote as a method for determining who becomes our next president. Hopefully, this will serve as a starting point for each of you for further study on the issue on your own. There have been various proposals sponsored over the course of the United States history in real life regarding this very issue. In our scenario today, the U.S. Senators Steve Bida and Cassandra Ulbrich have proposed an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. This amendment has already passed the House of Representatives. If it passes today, it will go on to the state for ratification. Senator Bida currently serves in the Michigan Senate. Dr. Cassandra Ulbrich, Ph.D., serves as the Macomb Community College Vice President and also co-president of the State Board of Education for the state of Michigan. Senators Bida and Ulbrich will call to testify in front of this Senate committee an expert on the Electoral College. That person is the Honorable Judge John Shimura from the 37th District Court. Judge Shimura and I served together in that district, and I'm very proud to call him a friend. Taking the position of those opposed to any amendment as to how we elect our president will be Senators Carl Morlinga and Laura Polizzi. Senator Morlinga currently serves as a judge in the 16th Circuit Court. Senator Polizzi is an attorney for the law group Cioni, Sarnicki, Reynolds, Daugherty, and Polizzi. Senators Morlinga and Polizzi will call Mickey Swatowski to testify as an expert regarding the Electoral College. Mickey Swatowski currently serves as the treasurer for the city of Roseville. Presiding over the hearing will be Vice President of the United States, the Honorable Matthew P. Sabaugh. In his capacity, he serves as President of the Senate and therefore will often be addressed as Mr. President. President Sabaugh also serves as a judge of the 37th District Court, which covers Warren and Centerline, and I'm proud to serve with him as well. Serving as Sergeant at Arms for this proceeding is Macomb County Sheriff Anthony Wickersham. Attorney Bill Barnwell is in attendance today, and he's serving as an understudy just in case somebody faints during testimony. This session is being broadcast and filmed by Sterling Heights Television, so it is possible that some of you in the audience may in fact appear during the final production. Attorney Stephen Steinhardt, who serves as one of the directors for the Macomb County Bar Foundation, has served as the producer for tonight's event. Each of you should have received a copy of the playbill on entry. It lists the participants I have mentioned. It also describes the sequence of events that we will be following today. While the time allocated for each opening remark, questioning of the witnesses is strictly monitored by President Sabaugh and enforced by Sergeant at Arms Wickersham, this event is not scripted. We expect vigorous and zealous presentations of the arguments from both sides. If you do desire to further your education about this experience, a list of sources used by the participants will be provided at post-production. I'm now holding up a copy of the proposed ballot each of you should have received on the way in. After the deliberations are concluded, we're going to ask that you mark this ballot either in the affirmative if you support a change or oppose the first clause. Please note that there are two separate sections that will require your vote, the Section 1 and Section 2, so you'll have to vote twice, and then we'd ask for demographic calculation purposes only if you'd circle the age range that you fall under. Thank you for attendance today. I hope you enjoy the show.
Ladies and gentlemen, the United States Senate now in session. The Honorable Vice President of the United States, Matthew Sabah, presiding.
Thank you, Sheriff Wickersham. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the historic mock Senate hearing. We are going to begin today's proceedings with an opening remark by each side, and we'll begin with opening remarks by Senator Cassandra Aldrich.
Good morning. One person, one vote. It's the belief that no person's vote is more or less valuable than the person sitting right next to you. But the Electoral College is the antithesis of one person, one vote. The Electoral College perverts this basic tenet of representative government by assigning value to a voter based solely on where they live. In exchange, we're told that the Electoral College protects us. But even there, it fails to live up to its promises. So what is the Electoral College? The Electoral College is a group of people who elect the President and the Vice President of the United States. Now you may be thinking, wait a minute, that's my job. Not so. When you cast a vote in a presidential election, you are not actually voting for the individuals on that ballot. Instead, you're voting for representatives to the Electoral College, or electors as they're called, from each state who will then vote for president. These electors are appointed by the political party of the winning candidate for each state. So what's wrong with that? Well, for one thing, it gives unequal power to small states. The number of electors a state has is determined by the number of congressional seats that the state holds, plus 2 for the U.S. Senate. So, for example, the state of Michigan has 16 Electoral College votes because we have 14 congressional districts and 2 U.S. senators. But this means that each state is guaranteed at least 3 Electoral College votes, which causes overrepresentation in small population states. So in real terms, what does that mean? Well, consider this. A vote cast in Wyoming is worth 3.5 times that of one cast in California. That's because the population of Wyoming is so small that each elector represents just 187,000 people, while the population in California is so large that one elector is actually representing 677,000 voters. Under the Electoral College, small population states have a disproportionate impact on the outcome. The second problem with the Electoral College is its ability to supersede the will of the people, electing a candidate who actually loses the popular vote. The person who comes in second can get elected. And in fact, this has happened 5 times in our nation's history, twice since 2000 alone. How does this happen? Well, all states, with the exception of 2, award all of their state's Electoral College votes on a winner-take-all basis. So if a candidate wins a state by only a handful of votes, that candidate still receives 100% of the Electoral College votes. So the more divided the country, the closer our elections, the more likely this is to happen. In our country's history, before 2000, it only happened 3 times, and in the last 16 years, it's happened twice. Is this a coincidence or simply a sign of the times we live in? Which means it's going to happen again. In a representative democracy, the person who wins the majority of the votes should win. To do otherwise is the equivalent of minority rule. So why do we accept this? Well, it's because we're told that the Electoral College actually protects us. It protects us from ourselves, from our own bad decisions, from the tyranny of the majority inherent in pure democratic systems. But does it really? While there is the ability of electors to go rogue and vote in contrast of their assigned vote, the likelihood of this happening is pretty small. I mean, after all, the political parties are the ones who are determining who these electors are. Those that are for keeping the current system also claim it ensures that small states will be ignored if we get rid of the Electoral College. The argument is that without the Electoral College, candidates would focus more on populous states like California and Texas and New York, which, by the way, make up 25% of the country's electorate. But the truth is, under the current system, most states, 40 in fact, are already ignored by the candidates. This is not just about large states, the small states too, and rural areas. Most attention is focused on a very small number of swing states every 4 years. So while the Electoral College may have made sense 200 years ago, the reality is there are better ways to run an election, ways that will ensure one person, one vote is valued and protected. We can no longer justify allowing the person who comes in second to become leader of the free world, nor can we continue to allow disenfranchisement of voters. The world has come a long way since the Founding Fathers devised this system, and we now have the ability, the technology, and the will to elect our leaders by popular vote. And we know we can do this because we do it for literally every other elected position in this country, except the most important one. So I urge my colleagues to support the proposed amendment so that the winner of the national popular vote should be declared the President of the United States, and if a candidate fails to receive the majority of the vote, then the top two candidates shall participate in a runoff. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Albrecht. At this time, Senator Laura Polizzi may give her opening remarks.
Good morning. I stand before you today and state that the Electoral College should remain. As our nation has grown and expanded, the American people have enjoyed a steady growth of personal freedom and civil liberty. While not perfect, our Electoral College system was carefully crafted by the Founding Fathers. The Founding Fathers were classically trained and carefully studied and looked to history, the history of great republics, to find a system that would protect the minority from the whims of the political majority. The Electoral College gives a voice to both large and small states. Our nation, under the Electoral College, has selected presidents serving through major civil rights movements, the Civil War, Red Scares, Industrial Revolution, and now terrorism. The Electoral College is structured so that each state starts with 2 senators, and congressmen are assigned to each state based on that state's population. There are 538 electors total, spelled out in our Constitution. 270 votes, more than half of the electors, are required to become president. Voters are voting for electors which cast their votes based on how people in their state voted. Why is this important, you might ask yourself? Why not just change the system to one person, one vote? Well, because this could drastically undermine our elections, and it could set off a chain of reactions with unknown, unforeseen, and unprecedented consequences. Without the Electoral College, a bare majority could tyrannize the country. With 270 electoral votes, you need support from all over the nation to win. Winning only the largest states or only one part of the nation will simply not work. Under a popular vote system, there would likely be more presidential candidates. Winning the presidency with a plurality would become the rule rather than the exception. Where you would have 5 or 6 presidential candidates, the president could get 20% of the vote and still become president. Without the Electoral College, the integrity of our elections would be affected. With a national popular vote, states would lose sovereignty. A centralized national popular vote would make it far easier for a foreign nation, such as Russia, to hack our election. It's easier to hack or influence one targeted national voting center than it is to do so by 50 individual states. With a national centralized system, any irregularity would require a recount of votes nationwide rather than state by state. So think of an issue with a voting center, or with identification, or a machine breaking down at a voting center in Florida. Having to recount the national vote rather than for that one state would cause chaos. It would also affect our nation's stability. The Electoral College maintains a balance between small and large states, making sure that the votes of a less populous state, such as Wyoming, for instance, which has about 500,000 people, compared to a state like California with over 37 million people, every vote is represented, no matter how small the state's population. Without the Electoral College, presidential candidates would campaign in the areas only where they could get the most votes, like New York, California, Texas, or Florida. Presidential candidates might concentrate all of their efforts in only those most populous areas. There would be no reason to campaign in every state. Huge resources would be wasted to spend in major media markets in those large cities. The president would be the president of New York and California, but the people of Idaho, Wyoming, or maybe even Michigan would be largely ignored. Take a look at this picture. All of the states in blue have a smaller population than that of Los Angeles County, the red dot. Under our present system with the Electoral College, the minority is protected by the majority. The Electoral College encourages coalition building, discourages voter fraud. And every state and every voter in each state is important. At the end of this hearing, you will hear from my esteemed colleague, Senator Marlinga, and at that time, we will ask that you oppose the proposed amendment and vote to maintain the Electoral College intact. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Polizzi. At this time, we will call the expert Judge John Shimura. And both Senators Albrecht and Beda will be questioning expert Judge John Shimura at this time. They've been allowed 20 minutes total between them. You may proceed.
Thank you very much for being here today. I understand you are an expert in Electoral College, so could you just start by giving us a quick overview? I know we heard a little bit here today, but from your perspective, how does the Electoral College work?
Well, Senator Albrecht, the most important thing to understand about the Electoral College is that it's not a college at all. It's not even a university. Not even an institution of higher learning, for heaven's sakes. It's made up of people who the voters don't even know, people who are chosen by political parties in a back room, usually with cigar smoke, and their job is to actually cast the vote for the President and Vice President of the United States. And when you vote, when citizens vote, they are voting to send these individuals to a place where they meet and for them to actually cast the vote as to who they think the President and Vice President of the United States is. This group of people is known as the Electoral College.
And I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
And are these electors required to cast a vote based on how the individuals in that state, the winner-take-all system?
You know, and that's the funny thing, Senator, they're not. They can vote whoever they want to vote for, and there are instances in the past when that's happened. You may decide that you vote for a certain president, and you think that the electors are going to vote for the person who you voted for to be president, but they don't have to. They can vote for Mickey Mouse if they like.
No. Thank you. Real quick question. To take a look, and you've heard the opening remarks of both those in support of this amendment and those in opposition to it. And one of the remarks was that keeping the Electoral College would maintain the opportunity for smaller states or rural areas to be represented. And it seems to suggest, or the suggestion was that, well, they're going to totally ignore those areas. But what is the reality of what happens today?
Well, the reality is, and we all kind of know this, is that presidential candidates ignore smaller states anyway. And there's a good reason why they ignore smaller states. There are no votes there. How many times did Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton go to Alaska? I don't know if they ever went. How many times did they go to South Dakota or North Dakota or Hawaii? Again, I don't remember that they ever went. And if they did, they only went one time. Why? There are no votes there. So even if you change the system to a popular vote, you're still going to have candidates go to the most populous states regardless of how the votes are counted, because that's where the votes are. And that usually works out to about 10 states that are the most populous, and they decide the election, which is the way it should be, because that's where people live.
Isn't it true, though, also, that even among the large states, if they're a non-contested state, they are also ignored in the process?
I'm sorry, what was that, Senator?
If they're a non-contested state, and meaning that it was, say, use Texas for an example, which has traditionally been going Republican, or California, which has traditionally been going Democratic. They're two of our largest states as far as population, but if we look at the last election, isn't it true that the candidates largely ignored those states in the process because those electoral votes were already in the other category?
Well, that's right. And because of the way the votes are counted, and again, it's important to go back and remember that the way they're counted is not by the individual voters, but by the electors chosen from the states. When the votes are counted that way, and you know that a state is likely going to have a majority of individual voters go Republican or Democrat, and then the electors supposedly follow that, if you're a candidate, you're not likely to go to those states to campaign. And the reason why is because you're going to lose the popular vote within that state, which means all of those people that voted against you aren't going to count for anything, because the electors make the decision, not the individual voters. Under the system that we're talking about, under the amendment that we're talking about, you may go to those states that you would likely lose the popular vote in, because you would still get the support of all the voters that would vote for you. Even though it might be less than 50%, they would still count towards your victory if you're that person. And that's different than the way it is right now.
So simply stated, if you live in a state that is predominantly Republican and you're a Democrat, your vote for president really doesn't count. Or vice versa, if you're a Republican in a state that's primarily Democratic and you want to vote for president, you vote for president, but you might as well just stay home and eat chocolate and watch TV, because your vote's not going to count.
Right, and that's a good point, Senator Beat. If you know, again, that your vote for president isn't going to count because you know that your state is going to be supporting the party that you're not voting for, then why vote for president? Because it really doesn't count, at least not in a direct sense, because the majority of voters in your state will determine who the electors are and who will vote for president, not you.
So again, as a practical matter, your vote doesn't count there. What would that do to voter turnout? We look at some of the statistics, and it seems to suggest that those states that are not contested have a much lower voter turnout in the election, and it also impacts the local races. Is that true?
Well, it would increase voter turnout if you change the system from what we have now, because it would give people incentive to vote for president, because, as I said, they would know that their vote would count. Once you increase voter turnout because they're voting for president, people are going to vote for all of the other races besides. There's not too many people that will go and simply vote for president and then not vote for any of the other races. They'll vote most of the time all the way down the ticket, even for incumbent judges most of the time. And we like that, and we want to encourage that. So that's why this is a good thing that you're talking about this amendment, because it helps people across the board.
Well, let's talk about another issue that could also impact turnout, and that is when someone casts a vote with the majority of the rest of the voters in the country and yet sees that their candidate is an elected president. How does this happen? How does the Electoral College allow for someone who comes in second in the national popular vote to actually become the President of the United States?
And that's a key point, Senator. And to understand that, again, you have to understand how the system works. Under the system that we have now, voters do not choose who the president is. And I know that seems strange, that seems weird, and maybe even something that was not understood by people. But the fact of the matter is, when you vote for president, you aren't voting for president. You are voting for people designated by the political parties in your state to actually count or actually make the vote as to who the president and vice president will be. And the way that's determined is by a certain number of electors coming from each state. The 2 senators from each state plus the number of congressional representatives. Though that is the number of electors that each state has to determine who the president will be. So it's possible that you could have a very slight majority of persons voting for one party versus another party in a certain type of state, and because it's a slight majority, the way it would come out is that the electors would make the decision as to who the president would be, and ignore that very high minority of people. And because it's counted not based upon the popular vote, not based upon who the individual voters decide who the president should be, but based upon who the electors decide, you can have this discrepancy. And because of that discrepancy, it's possible that the president is chosen by a majority of electors, but not by a majority of the voters, because it's done by state.
Does the current system distort the weight of each individual's vote across the nation? You have some states that are much larger population, others with a smaller population, because each state is guaranteed electoral votes are based on the number of congressional representatives they have, plus 2 of the U.S. senators. We call those the bonus ones, but each state has at least 3 electoral votes at that point. Does that distort the weight given to each individual's vote across the nation?
Sure, because the number of votes that you get isn't necessarily tied to the population. It's tied to the number of representatives that each state has. So, for example, and I do have some statistics. Look at the state of Texas. Texas, of course, is a large state, about 25 million people. Texas has 32 electoral votes, okay? 2 senators, and then there are 30 congressional districts within the state of Texas. So 30 plus 2 is 32. That turns out to be about 1 vote cast per 715,000 voters. When you divide it up, when you do the math, you divide 25 million divided by 32. Now take a look at another state, Wyoming. Wyoming is obviously not a populous state. 530,000 people live in the state of Wyoming. Wyoming gets only 3 votes. Why? 2 senators and 1 congressional district. It only has 1 congressional district because it's not as populous as Texas. So if you do the math, that works out to about 1 vote for 177,000 voters. So you were supposed to have a principle in this country of 1 man, 1 vote. Well, it really doesn't work out exactly 1 man, 1 vote across the country, because depending upon the number of people that you have in each state in relation to the electors, that 1 vote may be worth more in one state versus another.
Thank you, and that also draws another point. Your electoral votes aren't actually based on the number of votes that are cast in that state, or even people that are eligible to vote. It's based on population, because your House of Reps is determined on population, and your representatives, well, Senate, each state has 2. So your population could be a smaller percentage of active voters, those who are registered to vote but don't vote. That population and those electoral votes are also to determine people who aren't old enough to vote, may not be citizens even, but those electoral votes are attributed to that state based on just the population that lives there.
It has nothing to do with population. It has nothing to do with the actual number of votes cast. As we said before, Texas has 32 electoral votes. Texas is going to have 32 electoral votes no matter what. You could only have 1 person vote in the state of Texas. Guess what? It's going to cast 32 electoral votes for the president and vice president. You could have every voter, every one of those 25 million people in Texas vote. Guess what? Texas is still going to cast 32 electoral votes for president and vice president. That's the way the system is set up right now. That's how the Electoral College works.
So we've heard through this process that if we were to go to a popular vote, that it could somehow be manipulated, that there could be fraud involved in that. But that fails to recognize the fact that the Electoral College can also be manipulated, correct?
Correct.
So for things like gerrymandering?
Yes. First of all, when you talk about voter fraud really has nothing to do with this. You can always have voter fraud. It doesn't matter whether you have a system based upon the popular vote or the Electoral College. If people cheat while voting, if people are voting they shouldn't be voting, it's a problem either way. So voter fraud, I think, is kind of a red herring in this whole discussion. Where it can be manipulated, not so much based upon voter fraud, but based upon something called gerrymandering. Now, gerrymandering is when political parties decide how the congressional district lines are drawn, and it's usually the party in power in each state that decides that. The party in power naturally is going to draw the congressional districts in such a way so that that party can win most of them and compartmentalize the minority party in a few small districts to make their influence much less than the influence of the majority party. That's legal. That's been going on for a long time, although there is a Supreme Court case that's challenging that right now. But as of now, that is still legal. So what could happen if you had a system under the Electoral College system is that you would have these congressional districts drawn in such a way so that you would get the number of electoral votes could be favored towards one party versus another. You have to remember, under the Electoral College system, it's the states that decide how they're going to decide who those, the states decide how they're going to decide who the electoral votes are going to be or how they're going to be determined. So again, let's go back to the example with Texas. Texas has 32 electoral votes. Texas decides how those 32 votes are going to be determined. And what Texas could do is simply, if you decided to count the electoral votes based upon who wins in a congressional district, what Texas could do is draw those congressional districts in such a way to favor one party or the other, and thereby manipulate the number of electoral votes that could go to the Electoral College and actually vote.
And in fact, this has been proposed in various states, correct? So in 2014, the state of Michigan, for example, the Michigan legislature put out there a bill that would have changed how Michigan awards its electoral votes. Instead of awarding them by winner take all, it would have been awarded by congressional district, correct?
That is correct. And let's look at the example of this, of the election in, not this last election, but the one before it, where Barack Obama won and beat Mitt Romney. Michigan has 16 electoral votes. There was some legislation that didn't pass, but if it did pass, it would have resulted in Mitt Romney getting 11 electoral votes and Obama 5. And the reason why that could have happened if this legislation had passed is that Michigan would have determined its electoral votes by who wins the popular vote in each congressional district, not by a winner-take-all system, which is the way Michigan does it right now. And had that legislation passed, then the count would have been 11 electoral votes for Mitt Romney and 5 for Barack Obama. That's an example of how a state can manipulate the electoral votes that it sends to the Electoral College. Under a popular vote system, none of that would matter because you just simply count up the votes. And whoever has the majority wins, 50% plus 1. That's all you need, which I think is another virtue of the popular vote, and that it's easy to understand. Everybody gets it. Everybody understands democracy. Everybody understands majority. This system, the Electoral College system, is one that most people don't understand because it's very complicated. I'm trying hard to explain it here today, and I don't know how good of a job I'm doing explaining it because it's difficult. It's difficult to get people to understand that you're not voting for the president. Somebody else is. And how those votes are determined is a complicated thing in and of itself and can be determined different ways by different states.
Each of the states gets to determine how its electoral votes are cut. As a historical tidbit, Michigan actually had that system in the 1890s. The Democrats briefly controlled the legislature back then. Michigan was considered a red state if we would have used that term back then, if we were around then. But they had that system in place where they would split based on congressional districts. It also raises another question because if that were to occur, And in the rare situation in which we had a tie in the Electoral College, and it's theoretically possible you could have a 269 versus 269 split. And in that case, it goes to the House of Representatives, and perhaps you could run us through that process. And also maybe the likelihood of having a national vote of how many millions of people having a tie vote.
Well, that's correct, Senator Bita. It is possible to have a tie, 269 to 269. There are 538 electoral votes, 438 congressional districts, plus the 100 senators. That's 538 divided by 2, if my arithmetic is correct, 269. What do you do then? Well, the 12th Amendment to the Constitution tells you what you do, and that is you throw the election to the House of Representatives for the president and to the Senate for the vice president. Well, you know, do we want the House of Representatives to determine who these people should be? That could happen. And it hasn't happened, but it is possible. I suppose you could have a tie with the electoral vote system. I wouldn't bet on it, but if that would happen, of course, you'd have the same problem. But I think it's far, obviously, less likely to have a tie in the popular vote system than you would with the Electoral College.
Well, certainly if that were to happen, it would be a mess. When the Constitution was ratified in the 1700s, we were a largely agricultural country. It was a much smaller country. Today we're a superpower. You can imagine the gridlock and the troubles that we would have as a nation. Just to run through that process, it could be a couple months before we determine who was the president.
It could be, and that brings up another good point, Senator Vita. You know, and that is when the Electoral College system was adopted by the Founding Fathers, times obviously were a lot different than they are now. There was no internet. There was no easy way to communicate across state lines or very far at all. You wrote letters. There was obviously no telephones or things of that nature. And so counting up all of the votes back in the 1700s and totaling them all and then trying to decide who the president would be based upon the majority of those votes would be very difficult, very time-consuming, and you talk about subject to fraud, it would have been subject to fraud because you'd have to have a mechanism where all these pieces of paper would be counted and then the totals recorded somewhere and then transferred to another place and maybe to another place and then added up and then in that way you decide who the president or the vice president would be. Very difficult, very time-consuming, and just fraught with a lot of problems. And so one reason why the Electoral College came into existence was because the Founding Fathers didn't think that would be good. When you have electors chosen from each state, you get rid of that problem. Then all of a sudden, instead of, and Michigan wasn't a state then, but instead, let's say it was, instead of trying to count 10 million votes, you're only trying to count 16. That's much easier. Well, again, things have changed. We don't have any problem with computers now counting votes, and we know immediately what the vote count is. That is just an absolute non-issue. So I'm just not sure that the Electoral College, for historical reasons, is even necessary. It might have been necessary back when the Constitution was ratified in 1789. Not now.
If I could draw two little other historical parallels, when you look back in 1789, we didn't have political parties, and the number of eligible voters was much lower. Perhaps you'd like to comment on that.
Well, the number of eligible voters were much less then because the country's much smaller and the population was much smaller. But, you know, now...
Also, certain groups of people were prohibited from voting or didn't have...
I'm sorry, what? In what?
Certain groups of individuals, if you weren't a landowner or if you were a woman or you know, certain other people who were prohibited from voting at that time.
That's true, too. You had some people obviously could not vote. Women couldn't vote. Blacks couldn't vote. That's a non-issue now. You know, everybody 18 or older can vote. Obviously, all you have to do is register and you fill out the card and you're in. So that was another issue that the Founding Fathers would have had to have dealt with that we don't. And that's one reason why they came up with the Electoral College.
Okay, that's the time limit for the questions from Senators Ulbrich and Bita. Thank you, Senators. At this time, Senators Polizzi and Marlinga may conduct their cross-examination of the witness. 10 minutes.
Mr. President, I would ask that you give me some indication when I'm about 8 minutes into my cross-examination.
Yes, we will. Thank you.
Okay. Judge Shimura.
Senator, nice to see you again.
Nice to see you. Are you familiar with the quotation from Winston Churchill that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all of the others that have been tried from time to time? You familiar with that quote?
Yes, I'm familiar with it.
Okay. And doesn't it indicate that any time that you try to set up a government over people, even if it is the most idealistic one, a democracy, that there are always going to be problems in putting it into practice? Isn't that what it means?
No, I think what it means is that what Winston Churchill said it means, and that is that it's the best form of government when you consider that all forms of government are bad. We take democracy because that's the least bad of any other form of government that exists.
Okay. Well, we're pretty close. Well, let me ask you this way. You are familiar with the Federalist Papers and the constitutional debates, and you are aware that the framers of the Constitution debated various things like a direct popular election for President of the United States, like having the governors of the several states vote to who would be the President of the United States, and like the Electoral College. You realize that they went through all of those possibilities in the constitutional debates in Philadelphia in 1789. Are you aware of that?
Yes, you are correct.
Okay. And they came up with the Electoral College, correct?
Yes.
And you're saying you're now willing to just toss away all of that wisdom. You're willing to go out there on the 4th of July and wave a flag. You're willing to pledge allegiance to the Constitution of the United States, but when it actually comes down to living it on a day-to-day basis, you're ready to discard it at the drop of a hat, right?
No, I'm willing to raise the flag and have a nice barbecue on the 4th of July and do everything else that everyone does on the 4th of July, but using some considered wisdom and based upon some thought that I hope I was able to convey today, simply change only one part of the Constitution, and that is getting rid of the Electoral College based upon the considered reasons that I've set forth today.
Okay, well, you talk about this principle of one person, one vote, and put it on an altar, but you will have to admit that that was not a principle that the founders of our republic, the drafters of the Constitution, had in mind when they adopted the Constitution. You will agree with that?
Well, I don't know, Senator. I'm not as old as you. I wasn't there. They might have said that somewhere in the constitutional debates. That might have been a principle that was articulated. I don't know. I can't answer that.
Well, the House of Representatives was supposed to be the people's house. The representative group apportioned by population to be basically the closest that they would have said to one person, one vote. Although, unfortunately, in those days, they would have said one man, one vote. But we can maybe amend their thinking to a better way of thinking. One person, one vote. That was supposed to be how the House got elected, correct?
That is correct.
And the Senate was going to be elected because there were different interests. This is a republic, not a pure democracy like you have in Athens, where all 20,000 people get out and vote. You have to filter this through elected representatives. The Senate was supposed to protect the interests of the states because the legislatures in the several states, and not the people, were to elect the people who would be in the U.S. in the Senate, correct?
Yes, that is the job of the Senate, yes.
Okay. Now, of course, that's been amended. We've had an amendment that makes the senators elected by popular vote as well. But the President of the United States, perhaps the most significant office, they said, we do not trust the people to be able to know all of the candidates well enough to make this judgment. We don't want this to be decided by the several states. We want instead to have a group of people, the best and the brightest in the land, a group of electors who don't hold office, who are equal to the number of congressmen and senators, and they will, by their vote, by this small group, they will elect the president. That's what they said, correct?
Well, they didn't say that, yes, but not because they didn't trust the people or because they thought the people weren't smart. There were some practical considerations that they had to consider then that are not relevant now.
Okay, well, but don't you believe it is still a good idea to allow a real human being elector after the election is over, in the event that somebody is found to have been elected who is the tool of a foreign government or a person who has committed criminal activity, or a person who, for some reason, is considered incompetent to serve as the President of the United States, wouldn't the electors be that final check and balance to be able to say, I do not want to vote for this person and vote for somebody else? That's what we can do even today. Isn't that correct?
Precisely, and that's the problem.
Okay, you see it as a problem. Well, let me run down a scenario so that we don't offend the sensibilities of anybody who may have voted in the last election. I just want to ask about a possibility for the next election. And this could be the next election or 4 years after that or 4 years after that. I'm just going to use the names of some candidates because we know who they are and we can recognize these names, but they're really standing as basically stand-ins for those who might appear in the future that we don't know. Let's say, coming up in the 2020 election, that President Trump, because of his age or because of dissension in his party, decides not to run again. So we have a primary election in which maybe Mitt Romney and Ted Cruz and various other people from the Senate and the House, Vice President Pence run. And as a result of that, would you admit that it is possible that Mitt Romney could again be the nominee of the Republican Party? Is it possible?
Of course, sure, yes.
Okay. And on the other side, Hillary Clinton decides that she wants to re-up and do it again, and Bernie Sanders decides that he wants to up and do it again, and people like Kid Rock and Jeff Feiger and Kim Kardashian also decide that they want to get in.
Judge Merlinga, perhaps?
Pardon?
Judge Merlinga, perhaps?
Well, yeah, let's add me to the whole mix. And we go through the primary season, and we have a winner, and it turns out to be Hillary Clinton. Possibility?
Possibility.
Okay. Now, with that being the case, then it is also, is it a possibility that Bernie Sanders, having been burned once by not running again, decides that he would run as a third-party candidate the next time around? Is that a possibility?
Probably a likelihood.
Okay. Probably a likelihood. And now, with that being set up that way, where you have an establishment Republican in Romney, a conservative Democrat, or so-so, in Hillary Clinton, a liberal Democrat in Sanders, don't you think it might be possible for a fellow, let's say maybe a senator, maybe somebody who lost a hotly contested Senate race in difficult circumstance, I know, a Roy Moore from Alabama. Wouldn't it be possible for a Roy Moore of Alabama, under this system where we are now in the popular vote, to enter the presidential race as well, so that you would have Romney, Clinton, Sanders, and Roy Moore as the candidates? Is that a possibility?
Of course.
Okay. And if you take a look at the way that breaks down, you don't really have anybody in Romney or Clinton or Sanders representing the Trump base. You have a flawed candidate in Roy Moore because of the allegations of sexual improprieties. But you still don't have anybody representing the 32 to 34% Trump base. In that possibility where you have four candidates that, if they split the vote equally, would be 25, 25, and 25, isn't it possible that Roy Moore may get 28, 29, 30% of the vote, and in your scenario become the President of the United States because there's no human elector who could vote no?
Well, I guess that would be a possibility. I mean, the solution would be for a number of people to put you in as a write-in candidate, and as long as we got more than 25%, that problem would go away. But you are correct, Senator. That would be definitely a possibility if the plurality of people, the majority of people, if Roy Moore got the most votes of anybody, then he would be president. But I suppose that's what democracy is.
Yeah, and so let's get back to what the founders said. They were setting up a constitution that was not supposed to be perfect, but the least imperfect. And they tried to take care of as many of these odd possibilities as possible. But I guess in your system, we just can't cover them all, correct?
Well, there's nothing to cover. In my system, the people decide who the president is going to be. And if the people want Roy Moore to be chosen president out of the four that you've mentioned, then that's the president of the United States.
Yeah,
we do live in a democracy.
I pretty much rest my case. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Marlinga. Thank you, Judge Shimura. You are excused. The committee will now call the expert, Mickey Switalski. And beginning questioning Mickey Switalski will be Senators Marlinga and Polizzi, and they'll be afforded 20 minutes.
Senator Switalski, the audience has had a brief explanation of how the Electoral College works. I'd like to discuss with you what are the reasons why we should keep the Electoral College.
Okay, there are three chief reasons I think we should keep the Electoral College. One is the principle of the majority. The second is the idea of integrity. And finally, stability. So those are the three big reasons to keep the Electoral College.
And as to the principle of majority, what do you mean by that?
Well, it's interesting to listen to the proponents because I think their support is because their idea is so simple. It's, hey, let the people pick, and it's implied that the majority would pick the president. Let the popular vote pick the president. But senators, look at the ballot in front of you. The winner of the national popular vote shall be declared president. And you just heard that that winner has nothing to do with the majority. It could be Roy Moore with 26%. So, under the current system, the Electoral College system, you have to have a majority. You have to have 270 votes in the Electoral College. You've got to have support nationwide throughout the states to win. So that's really important. So when you think about this issue, you're being misled to think that popular vote is going to be what the majority of the people want, when really the system that gives you a majority is the Electoral College. So that's one important part of the argument for majority.
And I'd like to pause you there and say, if we adopted the system of a national vote, what would that majority look like? Or what could it look like?
Yeah, let's think about the example we had of 4 people at 25. Well, we've got actual elections from this last election in 2016 that I want to show you to get a picture of what that would actually look like. So, we're looking at the majority here. What is majority under our system? Well, let's look at majority of the Electoral College to win the presidency. In the popular vote, I would submit to you that plurality, that winner of the popular vote in a multi-candidate field could be less than 10%. So I'm going to show you a couple of elections. So the Dems came together and voted for their candidate up in the 72nd District in Michigan, this is the Republicans up just south of Grand Rapids. So they had 5 candidates, and the winner, you see, won a seat in the House of Representatives with 29%. And this is a primary, but these are the safe seats people were talking about. That's tantamount to winning the election. So 5 candidates split it. Johnson wins with 29. Well, this is a nonpartisan offender here. The Dems had the same situation. In 2016, State House in Wayne County in the 2nd District. They had 7 candidates, and the winner had 23%. It's not very much, is it? The Third Circuit Court in Michigan had 21 candidates. The winner had 9%. Is this a system that you we're bargaining for when you listen to, hey, let the people pick. You know, and on your yellow ballot, are you going to click that part that says the winner of the popular vote? The winner. What does winner mean? Well, here it meant 9%. Are you going to go for that? Is that what you thought you were buying when you were asked to vote for this? So, I would just suggest to you, and I think maybe this is what you were driving at with your question, what is this going to look like?
Yes.
Well, that's what it's going to look like, because they had 3 candidates in Minnesota for governor a few years back, and it's notoriety. You know, give me publicity, good or bad, just give me publicity. You got a name out there, you can win. So here's Jesse Ventura, elected governor of Minnesota. Okay, and
what kind of candidates can you say? You know, we see this slide, but can you explain to the audience what kind of candidates are we likely to see with the plurality election?
well, I would think, oh man, I've got to have this one. What kind of candidates? Thinks you could get 10%? We had a high school class coming here today. I don't know if they showed up, but if they're here, we can get 10%. And hey, Michigan, you might be looking at our new senator next year. You don't have to get a lot in a multi-candidate field, and you're in. So I hope when you mark your ballot, you don't go for that first option there of whoever wins, whoever gets the most, whoever gets a plurality, even if it's 9%, they're your new senator, representative, or president.
So as to your second reason, integrity, how could getting rid of the Electoral College affect the integrity of our elections?
Well, we had some discussion about this before, and I think it was kind of referred to, but I want you to get a clear picture of what this would look like. And the contrast you were given was, hey, you could theoretically get a 269 to 269 tie. You know, that'd be chaos. It goes to the House of Reps. They vote by state, but, you know, it'd be messy. It's never happened, but wow. And in contrast, you know, we're millions of people voting, a country of, how many are we, 340 million people now? Is it going to come out to an exact tie? No, that's much less likely, isn't it? Well, I want you to think back to the year 2000 in Florida. All right, so we had the closest election in history in Florida. And we had total chaos in Florida trying to do the recount. So we want an accurate election, right? So we got total chaos in Florida. We got multiple lawsuits. It's January. We still don't know who the president is. It's in the Supreme Court. That was a wrenching experience.
And can you explain to the audience why this would cause chaos? What could happen?
If you change to popular vote, that's not Florida anymore. That's every state. So it's a close election. A vote in Wyoming is the same as a vote in Florida. So you're looking for irregularities everywhere, in every state. You're challenging, hey, the polls, there were long lines there. Some of my voters didn't get to vote. Hey, there was a power outage. Those machines, you know, we got to have a full recount. Hey, the weather was horrible. They should have extended the poll. You'll have a fight in all 50 states. On the Electoral College, it's going to be localized in a super close election, the closest we ever had. You're looking at one state, Florida. You got chaos in one state, Florida. Make it a national popular vote, you got 50 Floridas. You got chaos everywhere.
And as to the security of our elections, how would that be affected?
Well, let's see here. Security of our election, and I think Carl made this point quite well. If you're going to hack, it's much easier to hack one national counting center than 50 different states. And you hack and disrupt one centralized polling source, throw all your resources at it, I think you could cause serious havoc and make people question the result, whatever it is, and kind of lose the feeling that, hey, was this president elected? Is that really accurate? In the Electoral College, you've normally run up a pretty good majority in the Electoral College. If you look at the history of the votes, it's generally a big majority. Much more stable.
And as to the quality of our elections, how could abolishing the Electoral College affect the quality?
The argument has usually been about, hey, you're not going to campaign in these states that aren't competitive. They'll never visit Wyoming, ever. There's hardly any people there. Well, when you look at the way the system works, think about Iowa. Think about New Hampshire. The candidates, there's no votes there. Nobody lives there. They're never going to campaign there. They live there for 4 years. They live there. They move in. They're there for 2 years campaigning, trying to win those primaries. And you might not like Iowa or New Hampshire, but you get to see them campaign there the way that no one will ever campaign against. You get to see them knocking doors and kissing babies, going to coffee shops, eating donuts, talking to people. If you change to a national popular vote, you know what the campaign's going to be? It's going to be all Facebook, social media, and advertising. You will never have an unscripted moment again. You will never engage in a debate. You just got to hack out your 10%. It'd be horrible.
And as to our election stability, could it affect our nation's stability?
Well, I think it would. I think one of the great things we have going for us, 228 years, we've had a good, strong two-party system. Provides a choice and it provides a majority, whoever gets a majority. And I think this change would wreck the two-party system. It would lead to multi-candidate fields. And it's an unintended consequence, I think. And I think that's much less stable when you have multiple candidates getting partial votes and then making deals about, who's going to get what. I think you're asking to throw away 228 years of stability for something that I don't think you bargained for. Secondly, that's a two-party system. I'm going to throw that away. The reason this was set up is because states matter. States matter. States get a voice. They get, you got to win states. And the campaign would be mostly directed at, population, urban centers. And what we've got right now is a balance between rural and urban. You got to appeal to large and small states. And this would wither and die. And party organizations and states would wither and die under this change. And I got to ask the proponents, are Wyoming and Rhode Island, overrepresented, really? Are they bossing California around? Is that the problem that we're trying to correct? That, Wyoming's throwing its weight around too much? and then on the other side of the argument, they say, well, the candidates never go to Wyoming. It's inconsistent. And I got to say one last thing to you. On your ballot, there's a second clause. And I look at this as the proponents know that the idea of a minority voted, 10, 20% person winning, they know that's just, it can't happen. It's horrible. So they've thrown in this extra clause. Okay, so they recognize, we're going to have a runoff because you can't have somebody win with 10% of the vote. So now we have to have another election. And I sympathize with them because I'm sure you all agree. The presidential campaign is just too damn short. It needs to be longer. So at the end of it, when it's finally over, you'll get to say, okay, now we get to do it all over again. Let's have the runoff.
And can you explain what a runoff would be like? How long would it last?
How long would it last? The proponents, they throw this out. We'll have a runoff. You'll have a runoff. When is the runoff? Is the regular election in November? Or is the initial primary election, if you call it, earlier? And I remember, senators, you would all remember this. In the election of 2012, Michigan had a primary. And, I think Obama boycotted it because he said it was all hooked up for Hillary. So then, and we had it early, so the National Party said, we're not going to count your votes. So then the proponents came back to us in the Senate, it's in Michigan, but hey, let's have another primary. Another primary. Yeah, that first one didn't work out. Let's have another one. What's the cost of that? $10 million. No. So how much is this going to cost you? You're going to have a second national election, and this isn't even a state primary like we already have. Now it's a national election twice a year to end up with this runoff. So you've doubled your cost, and I think you've ensured a Kardashian rock runoff. So good luck with that.
And how could this affect the campaign spending with the media markets? I'd just like to take you back to there.
Yeah, I see a social media and advertising television campaign, scripted, no debates. There'll be so much money poured into those efforts. And remember, you got to get enough advertising to get yourself to 10, 15, 20%. Who's going to win that? Who's going to, the most notorious, for whatever reason, person that has the best name recognition, for good or ill, that has no background whatever, they're going to win.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Polisi.
Do you have any follow-up?
Great.
Senators Beda and Albrecht may now question expert Mickey Switalski for 10 minutes.
Well, that was adorable.
Thank
The cartoons, really. But I want to bring us back to the reality of what we're talking about here today. First of all, we heard a lot of fuzzy math thrown around, right? We heard that you could have 4 candidates, 3 of whom get 25% of the vote and 1 gets 28. Well, I'm no mathematician, but that doesn't add up. And neither did a lot of these numbers you saw here today. And the reason is because we're talking about a general election, not a primary election. So by what we are talking about here today, we are not getting rid of primaries. We're not getting rid of the party system. We are not getting rid of the mechanisms or the organization in which it takes to become a candidate for president of the United States. A Kardashian cannot simply put their name on the ballot, can they?
No, but I think that's the fundamental issue is the proponents are thinking that you will just graft on a final result of popular vote winner onto the current system. And I think that wouldn't happen. And you are proposing a new primary, because under your second clause, that makes the first go around a primary, followed by a runoff.
But a presidential primary is different than a primary, correct? Because each state, each political party from each state determines how they are going to select their nominee to run for president. So some use caucus systems, some use primaries. It's a conglomerate of issues. You talked about the primary in Michigan in 2008. That was a decision by the Democratic Party to run that type of primary. So we are not talking about getting rid of that process. We are simply talking about once that process has manifested itself, then who gets to decide who becomes the leader of the free world? Is it the majority of the voters, or is it a majority of Electoral College? So you also failed to mention until the very end of your testimony the runoff system, and you just mentioned it again. But the runoff system does protect against, let's say you have 4 candidates and one of them miraculously gets 28% while the others get 25%. You then have a runoff system with the top 2 vote getters, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And so that does protect from the person who got 28% becoming the President of the United States if they are, in fact, the least popular of all of the candidates, correct?
I just wouldn't look forward to voting for either Rock or Kardashian.
How many look forward to now? I mean, what did you think in the last election? Were you excited to vote? A lot of people that I heard from said no, and yet that's under the current system. So how would this be different?
Well, I'd say either one of the 2 that were on the ballot this time were preferable to Rock and Kardashian.
Again, we're not discussing a Kardashian running for president because, like you mentioned yourself, it's very expensive to run for president. Is that not right?
Yeah, apparently she's making bank.
And it requires a huge organization, does it not?
I fear an unintended consequence is an organization, boy, not so important. I don't think Trump really had an organization. He had the ability to get free media and command the debate.
But he had the Republican Party. Is that not an organization?
He defeated them soundly in the primary, and I think one of my consequences I see is the 2-party system, the parties will be incredibly weakened by this, to the point where people outside the parties really will take over.
What is an interesting comment that you have said, and when you look at the history of the Electoral College, it didn't anticipate the formation of a 2-party system. That didn't evolve until the 1820s. So what you're saying is that somebody, the Kid Rock, could claim the party mantle, have all that organization in all 50 states, going to be able to win a nomination or get the name on the ballot in all 50 states, because all 50 states still have the safeguards of determining who can be on the ballot in those states. There's certain criteria you have to do. We're not changing that at all. We're just saying we're taking this antiquated system that doesn't work, that has a potential for even bigger problems, and replacing it with something that, God, what a novel concept. Everybody's vote counts the same. Mr. Expert Witness, it seems to me that if you're talking about an integrity of a system, you want a system in which everybody's vote is treated the same and is treated fairly. Some of the other arguments you made are kind of side arguments, and some of your examples certainly are local elections. That's a different issue. Now we're going to the second part of the proposed amendment is the runoff election, which we have that in there. We don't have the exact dates or the time or how that would work, but the amendment that has been proposed would be if you didn't have anybody getting the majority, so you had multiple candidates come out, then you'd have a runoff between the 2 of those. And I agree, I don't like the election cycle may be going a little bit far as it is, but I think there is something to be said about the integrity of a system if the person who gets the most votes wins.
Well, I would just say to my fellow senators out there that you are elected in a system where you get 2 votes for your state in Wyoming and in California. And I think you've run a pretty good country for 220 years. And are you gonna vote for something that diminishes your power as a senator? Are you going to, because if he's applying this one person, one vote thought to you, or to the presidency, he's coming next for you. Once you accept the principle that that's the only fair way to do things, then Wyoming, so long to one of you senators, and California, welcome to 36 more of you. I mean, is that really what you want? Is that principle so important that you're going to apply it to the presidency and then apply it to yourselves?
I would remind the senators that each and every one of you was elected by popular vote. And how would you feel if you received the majority of the popular vote and your opponent won instead? Just keep that in mind. Let's talk about security for a minute, because you talked about the fact that right now we have a secure system because we have a form of elections in which states run their elections, and you know, we basically operate these at the local level. And somehow if we do a popular vote for president, that we're having a nationalized, centralized polling source, as you called it. I don't understand why we would change what we do now. If we have these elections now, and if they're state by state, they're county by county, they're precinct by precinct, and yet we're still able to count all of the votes and do it in a secure manner, why would the fact that we're simply changing how the end result, instead of having electors then vote for president, just using the vote that we already know exists, how does that change the security?
Well, I think in a close election, you would have a situation where there's always, you know, the lesson of 2000 was there's always irregularities. You know, when you start looking closely at Florida, there were a million problems with it. Man, how accurate is our vote? There's a lot of play there. Well, now multiply that by 50 and send that all into one centralized place, and you're going to generate multiple challenges. And if someone's trying to hack, they got one place to hack and try to disrupt that. It just seems an easier enterprise.
I don't think you're reading the amendment correctly. Again, the Constitution allows the states to choose their own and run their own elections. So we would still continue with all 50 states and voting jurisdictions that are there right now. And then actually, that system is just as likely to be hacked, and the electoral system only enhances that. Because if you have a state in which it's just a couple hundred votes or a dozen votes, even one vote is hacked, and you've got 11 electoral votes, that entire state's votes, all 11 or 36 or whatever that, or 16 in Michigan, they go to the other party. Whereas if you had a system where you're going by popular vote, that one vote difference, it's not going to make much of a difference. It's still wrong that it happens, but it's not going to have the weight that it does in Electoral College. And that'd be true. If you look at it, keep the same system, which we are advocating, that all the states do their own thing, but it's the electoral votes that are gone. It's just popular vote. Wouldn't it be true in a situation like that if you had a one fraudulent vote in a popular vote scenario in a state like Florida, in which that one popular vote's not going to make a difference in the bigger scheme of things, but it would, wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, but most states aren't competitive, so I suspect.
I use Florida as an example.
Well, Florida would be competitive, but the majority of states are not that close, so why bother hacking one vote there? Concentrate on hacking the one national collection point, disrupting
again,
it.
Each state is collecting their own state.
Yeah, and then they're all
votes.
sending it into your, on your national runoff. They're all sending it into Washington, D.C. to be tabulated. Hey, can we disrupt that? Can we crash that?
So each state's reporting its own votes, and then somewhere in the transmission, it's going to show up as a different number, is what you're claiming.
I don't know. I would think they'd have their entire, IT, their every resource, trained on that one site and figuring out ways to disrupt it.
Obviously, there would be, we've seen efforts of others to disrupt and to do fraudulent activity, but it's probably a...
We've got numerous investigations going on in Congress right now to determine, did this happen? Could it happen? How would it happen? and we've got to protect ourselves from that.
but the bigger
Just
issue
seems
is-
to me that centralizing it just makes it easier for the hacker.
It might seem that way, but if you, again, you have all these 50 different jurisdictions and they're the collection point, you'd be able to determine where the fraudulent activity comes from and you could isolate it a lot easier. And of course, what you're talking about is a technical element of it, not the amendment itself. If we take that issue out, which is an important issue, but it's sort of a red dog in this debate because of the impact that would have. It has a much greater impact when fraudulent activity occurs in a contested state and that state's entire electoral votes go into the Electoral College versus you'd have to have a really large number of fraudulent votes, and that's more likely to be detected and determined and found out than something that's as simple as 10 or 20 votes in a state.
Well,
Look, the last election.
Nixon-Kennedy was extremely close popular vote. I mean, that's
and
one you could have.
And Illinois, the speculation or some rumors that there was some mob activity that
And that was
may have
before the
switched it.
days of, computerized elections. And
But that was the electoral vote that switched it. The popular vote in that
popular
state
vote was
wouldn't have made
close.
much of a difference.
yeah, the popular vote was really close. That would be the one to look at, I would think, to say, could a foreign power hack that and disrupt that? Is that within the realm of possibility?
But we already know that the system right now is subset to this. So having it as a popular vote where a 1 point difference in a state is not going to make, a 1 vote difference in a state is not going to make as much of an impact in a national vote when you collect all the votes as it would for an electoral college situation, particularly in a state that's contested or has a large number of votes.
I'm not sure I follow you, but it sounded good.
That's the extent of the
in
time.
other words, okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Sotalski.
Is that my closing?
And now, Senator Bida, you may give your closing remarks.
Thank you. This has been a really interesting enterprise. In November 2000, newly elected New York Senator Hillary Clinton promised that when she took office in 2001, she would introduce the constitutional amendment to abolish the Electoral College, the 18th century state-by-state winner-take-all system for selecting the president. She never pursued that promise, rather ironic, and imagine it's a decision that must haunt her today. In 2016, she won almost 3 million more votes than Donald Trump, but lost by a significant margin in Electoral College. In addition to 2016, there are 4 other times in American history, in 1824, 1876, 1888, and in 2000, where the candidate who won the Electoral College lost the national popular vote. Each time, a Democratic presidential candidate lost the election due to this system. For that reason, views on the fairness of the Electoral College are often partisan. Not surprisingly, many Clinton supporters have called for its reform or abolition. But most recent polls indicate that supporters of both parties feel that this 19th century system of choosing a president should be modified or abolished. Nevertheless, others continue to make the case for preserving the Electoral College in its current form, usually using one of a couple arguments. I think it's useful to review the evolution of the Electoral College. During the 1787 Constitutional Convention, the delegates distrusted the passions of the people, and particularly distrusted the ability of the average voters to choose a president in a national election. The result was the Electoral College, a system that gave each state a number of electors based on its number of members in Congress. On a date set by Congress, state legislatures would choose a set of electors who would later convene in their respective state capitals to cast their votes for president. Because there was no political parties back then, it was assumed that electors would use their best judgment to choose a president. With the rise of the two-party system, the modern Electoral College continued to evolve. By the 1820s, most states began to pass laws allowing voters, not state legislators, to choose electors on a winner-take-all basis. Today, in every state except Nebraska and Maine, whichever candidate wins the most vote in a state wins all the electors from that state, no matter what the margin of victory. Just look at the impact that this system had on the 2016 race. Donald Trump won Pennsylvania and Florida by a combined margin of about 200,000 votes to earn 49 electoral votes. Hillary Clinton, meanwhile, won Massachusetts by almost 1 million votes, but earned only 11 electoral votes. The winner-take-all electoral system explains why one candidate can get more votes nationwide while a different candidate wins the Electoral College. Despite these issues, many continue to defend this antiquated and out-of-date system. And here's why they're wrong. Number one is that the electors filter the passions of the people. College students first learning about Electoral College will often defend the system by citing its original purpose, like our opponents here. It's to provide a check on the public in case they make a poor choice for president. But electors no longer work as independent agents or as agents of the state legislature. They're chosen for their party loyalty by party conventions or party leaders. In presidential elections between 1992 and 2012, only over 99% of electors kept their pledges to a candidate. And there were only two faithless electors. One Gore elector from Washington, D.C. cast a blank ballot in 2000 to protest the lack of congressional representation for the District of Columbia residents. And in 2004, one Kerry elector from Minnesota voted for vice presidential candidate John Edwards for both president and vice president, an apparent mistake, since none of Minnesota's electors admitted to the action afterwards. In 2016, we've seen the largest number. There were 5 Democrats and 2 Republican faithless electors in those situations. One of the Democratic electors voted for a gentleman called Faith Two Trees, who was apparently a tribal leader in the state that he was from. There have been scattered numerous faithless electors in past elections, but they're never influenced the outcome of a presidential election. Since the winner-take-all laws began in the 1820s, electors have rarely acted independently or against the wishes of the party that chose them. A majority of states even have laws requiring partisan electors to keep their pledges with voting. Yet, some of this year's Republican electors may not have been big supporters of the Donald Trump presidency, but despite the best efforts of the Clinton voters to get them to switch sides, there's no evidence that some electors may consider for voting somebody like Paul Ryan to prevent a Trump majority and throw the election in the U.S. House of Representatives. One of the other myths around the Electoral College is that rural areas or smaller areas would be ignored. Since 2000, the popular argument for the Electoral College made on conservative websites and talk radio is that without the Electoral College, candidates would spend all their time campaigning in big cities and would ignore low population areas. Other than this odd view of democracy, which advocates spending as much campaign areas where few people live as in areas where most Americans live, this argument is simply false. The Electoral College causes candidates to spend all their campaign times in cities in 10 or 12 states rather than in 30, 40, or 50 states. Presidential candidates don't campaign in rural areas no matter what system is used, simply because there are not a lot of votes to be gained in those areas. Data from the 2016 campaign indicates that 53% of campaign events for Trump, Hillary Clinton, Mike Pence, and Tim Kaine in the 2 months before the November election were only in 4 states: Florida, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Ohio. During that time, 87% of the campaign visits by the 4 candidates were in 12 battleground states, and none of the four candidates ever went to 27 states, which includes almost all of rural America. Even in the swing states where they do campaign, the candidates focus on urban areas where most voters live. In Pennsylvania, for example, 72% of Pennsylvania campaign visits by Clinton and Trump were in the final 2 months of their campaigns, and they were to Philadelphia and Pittsburgh areas. In Michigan, all 8 campaign visits by Clinton and Trump in the final 2 months of their campaign were to the Detroit and Grand Rapids areas, with neither candidate visiting the rural parts of the state. The Electoral College does not create a national campaign inclusive of rural areas. In fact, it does just the opposite. And one of the comments was that the system as we have it now promotes stability by creating a mandate to lead. Some have advocated for the continuation of the Electoral College because its winner-take-all nature at the state level causes the media and the public to see many close elections as landslide. thereby giving a stronger mandate to govern for the winning candidate. In 1980, for example, Ronald Reagan won 51% of the national vote, but 91% of the electoral vote, giving the impression of a landslide victory and allowing him to convince Congress to approve parts of his agenda. In 1992 and 1996, Bill Clinton twice won comfortable majorities in the Electoral College while winning less than half of the national popularity vote. In both those years, third-party candidate Ross Perot had run. In 2016, Donald Trump won the large majority in the Electoral College while winning fewer popular votes than Clinton nationwide. Nonetheless, former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani announced that Trump's Electoral College victory gave him a mandate to govern. Perhaps for incoming presidents, this artificial perception of landslide support is a good thing. It helps them enact their agenda. But, as we've seen recently, it can also lead to backlash and resentment in the majority or near majority of the population whose expressed preferences get ignored. Look no further than the anti-Trump protests that have erupted across the country since last November 8th. Hardly a stable system. Now, some advocate that all 50 states adopt the Maine and Nebraska system for dividing up electoral votes by congressional district. Yet such a system in larger states would likely lead to increased political conflict and even more claims of rigging due to the extreme gerrymandering often used to create districts. Abolishing the Electoral College completely would require a constitutional amendment requiring 2/3 approval from both houses of Congress and approval by 38 states, a process very unlikely to happen in today's partisan environment. One way to create a national popular election for president without amending the Constitution is a plan called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. And it was created by Stanford University computer science professor John Koza. And the idea is to award each state's electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote instead of the winner of the state popular vote. And it's received some support among some of the states, but mostly the Democratic ones. Because Republicans won the two recent presidential elections that were where the Electoral College winner differed from the national popular vote winner, many party supporters have defended the Electoral College as a way to preserve the role of rural, usually Republicans, voters in presidential election. Rural states do get a slight boost from the two electoral votes awarding to the state due to their Senate seats. But as stated earlier, the Electoral College does not lead to rural areas getting more attention. There is no legitimate reason why a rural vote should count more than an urban vote in a 21st century national election. Thus, we have the amendment before us for discussion today. And I stand before you with a very simple proposition. In elections for president and vice president of the United States, every vote should be equal. The presidential candidate who receives the most popular votes throughout the United States should win the presidency. Every voter in every state should be politically relevant in every election. Obviously, there are some shortcomings with the current system. Voters are effectively disenfranchised in 4/5 of the state in presidential elections. One of the consequences of the statewide winner-take-all rule is you win the popular vote in the state and you win all the electoral votes, is that presidential candidates do not campaign in states in which they are comfortably ahead or hopelessly behind. Presidential candidates ignore such states because they do not receive additional or fewer electoral votes based on the margin by which they win or lose those states. Thus, in practical terms, a vote matters in presidential politics only if it's in cases in a closely divided battleground state. 12 of the 13 least populated states are spectator states, including 6 that have regularly gone Republican: Alaska, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, and South Dakota, and 6 that have regularly gone Democratic: Hawaii, Vermont, Maine, Rhode Island, Delaware, and the District of Columbia. Thus, the current system does not reliably reflect the nationwide popular vote. The current system actually makes it possible for a candidate to win the presidency without winning the most popular votes nationwide. It is possible for a candidate to win the presidency without winning the most popular votes. Of the 58 presidential elections between 1789 and 2016, there have been 5 elections in which the candidate with the most popular votes nationwide did not win the presidency. There have also been 6 presidential elections since World War II in which a shift of a relatively small number of votes in 1 or 2 states would have elected a presidential candidate who lost the popular vote nationwide. One example in 1976, which was a relatively close election, Jimmy Carter led Jerry Ford by about 1.6 million votes nationwide, but a shift of about 3,000 votes in Hawaii and 5,000 votes in Ohio would have elected Ford.
Senator Bida, your time is up. Do you want to wrap it up?
Yeah. Okay. I went faster at home when I read it. I ask that you support this amendment. In conclusion, it's time to change the system to accurately reflect the will of the people. The vote of every voter in every state should be politically relevant in every election. The wisdom of our founding fathers was to recognize and plan for change. And that's why we have an ability to change and amend the Constitution, and it's been amended a number of times. With that, we ask your support and the vote yes on both portions of the amendment before us today.
Thank you, Senator Bida. Senator Marlinga, you may give your closing remarks.
Okay. And Mr. President, Mr. Sergeant at Arms, I ask your leave to please stand up and yell when I'm at 8 minutes so that I know when I only have about 2 minutes left, because I might not be looking at you. I apologize for that.
Should have asked for that myself.
I think that our expert witness, Mr. Switalski, really hit the nail on the head when he said that the flaw in the thinking of these reformers is that they just assume that everything will be grafted on to what we already have, and that we will have exactly the same system, except that now the popular vote will decide the President of the United States. Their inability to grasp that everything is going to change, I think, was highlighted when Senator Ulbricht made the comment, well, 28% obviously doesn't add up to 100, it adds up to more than 100%. The point is, do the math. If you have 4 competitive candidates, and in the example that I gave, and Judge Shimura admitted that this would be a possibility, you would have a Romney, a Clinton, a Sanders, and a Roy Moore. Because of the distrust that we have in the American electorate today, the sway of the old political parties isn't what it used to be. And therefore, outsiders have a much better chance of getting a higher percentage of the vote. If you have multiple candidates, the amount of the vote that you need to be the highest vote getter as a percentage basis continues to go down. So that if you had 4 candidates who would split it equally, that would be about 25%. If one gets a little bit more, like 28%, that means it has to come up from somebody else's vote total. But the point is that if you have somebody who can appeal to a 28, 29, 30% of the vote and lock in those votes because of that person's extremism or his personality or her money or whatever it is, that you can skew the entire system. And that's the danger that we're heading towards minority government and extremism if we adopt this measure. And I mean, I picked on Roy Moore, but I mean, I think it's a perfect example. I mean, here's a person who will either win the election in Alabama in a week or so, or will lose. If he wins, he will be a national celebrity because he overcame all of this bad publicity. If he loses, he will be bitter. He will say that he was convicted without a fair trial, and there will be millions of people around the country who will think that he got a raw deal. And if there is not somebody who can pick up that vote that Donald Trump was able to seize of the distrustful Americans, tired of the system, wanting to have the swamp drained, if you have establishment people like Romney and Clinton and Sanders, all the more likely that a Roy Moore could be the candidate who gets that plurality. And that's the problem with a plurality president.
And as we saw from the example of the Wayne County Circuit Court vote that Mr. Switolski put on the board, with enough candidates, you can get that vote down. The top candidate can have 10%. And in that Wayne County vote, I believe that if you did have a runoff, if you thought that was a cure, because now we would get majority government through a runoff, you would have somebody with 9% running against somebody with 8.9%. You could still have two of the most extreme, unqualified people who just happen to lock in a section of the vote, maybe because of their extremist views. And look, it is an absolute sure bet that everything would change, because now with only needing a plurality, people would get on the ballot. It takes only 1,000 petition signatures to get on the ballot in Rhode Island, 6,000 petitions in Wyoming, 30,000 in Michigan. Now you think 30,000 is tough. I once had to get 20,000 for a campaign. It wasn't all that tough. And if you're a millionaire, which I'm not, but if you're a millionaire and you can pay petition signers, you can pay petition gatherers to go out, you could easily get your name on the ballot in every state. So it is not an unusual or unanticipated specter that we might have 20, 30, 40 candidates on the presidential ballots, meaning that the winning margin, the winner might need only 6 or 7% of the vote. And I suppose one of the questions would be, well, what stops this from happening now? Two things: the Electoral College and the 12th Amendment to the Constitution. The 12th Amendment says that after you get the vote of the electors, it says, then from the persons having the highest number not exceeding 3 on the list who voted for president, the House of Representatives shall choose immediately by ballot the president. What that refers to is that if you don't have a majority of the Electoral College, it goes to the House of Representatives for a vote. Each state gets one vote, with the representatives voting as a caucus, and the majority of that state's vote goes to whoever the president would be, but you only get to look at the top 3. So what has stopped people from running as third-party candidates nowadays? Well, if you are a Democrat and you are going to mount a serious third-party challenge and you can't get a majority of electoral votes, you almost guarantee that the election will be thrown into the House, where the Republicans have 32 out of the 50 delegations. So if you are a serious Democrat, loyal to the party, you are guaranteeing that the Republican candidate will win. If you are a Republican, you're not going to run because you're going to be bucking your party establishment who is backing somebody else. And you know, even if you are one of the 3 names that are there, that because you are not the nominee of the party, you're not going to win anyway. And so the only people who run in third parties now are gadflies who just want to get their name out, have the thrill of seeing their name on the ballot, but they know, if they are serious politicians, that they have no chance to win. None. Because if they prevent a majority vote in the Electoral College, it goes to the House of Representatives. Right now, the Republicans control, Democrats have controlled in the past, but it means that no serious candidate runs as a third-party candidate. With this proposal by this group of naive do-gooders, thinking that, oh, we're going to make it all better, we're going to assure that we're going to have minority candidates. The person with 10% is going to be running against the person with 9%. Ray Moore against Jeff Feiger. Kim Kardashian against, I won't even go through the whole possible list of candidates, but basically anybody with a little bit of glitz, a little bit of glamour, a lot of money is going to be able to get their name on the ballot. Once their name is on the ballot, it's off to the races. And there's no guarantee. It is the end of the two-party system, because we will never use the 12th Amendment again, because we're going to be deciding it by popular vote. And then if they say, well, but we can still have a majority president by having a runoff, remember that Wayne County ballot, the 9%er against the 8.9%er. That's what we're going to have. We're going to be encouraging extremism, minority rule, thank you, and By the way, that's the other flaw, is that somehow we think that democracy always is going to work, that even if we have a plurality vote, it's going to always come out to get the best qualified people. Remember this, and just look at the primary systems that we have now. The way that people win in the primary is not by being the good guy in the middle. The way that people win is to take the most extreme position possible, because by taking the most extreme possible, you lock in those votes that you need to win. You get this undying loyalty from whether it be 15, 20, 30%, or maybe in these new elections, 9%, you lock it in. And so it makes sense then to go into these presidential elections, not trying to bring the country together, not trying to create a consensus, not looking at real facts, but talking about made-up facts and alternate facts. Instead of the good, solid people that the framers had in mind who would be running for president, you basically have the nutcases, the extremists at either end, getting their small percentage and holding on to them, and then having a runoff at the end. If that's what you want, vote for this so-called reform. If you love the United States of America the way it is, vote to stop this madness. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Marlinga.
The amendment before you is, frankly, part of that American democracy. And I could wrap myself in the flag, too, because I think when we look at your vote and the voices, whether you live in rural Ohio or you live in Detroit, Michigan, or you live in California or Hawaii or Texas or whatever, that your vote, regardless of where you live, regardless where you travel to or get transferred to, should count the same in an election. And that's all this amendment does. It doesn't dissipate the parties. In fact, if you take a look at the country, it's really kind of an absurd argument to say that somebody like a Kardashian or a Kid Rock would be able to win, because they don't have that party apparatus. They'd still have to go through the primary systems to become that party's nominee. They would still have to be able to raise that money and that profile to do that. And I still, at the end of the day, trust the American public. I trust the American public to make the right decision on an election that's going to impact them, not only for their lives, but their children and their grandchildren and to generations above. And they're not going to go in this crazy scenario that they've done. Now, I also believe in the wisdom of our founding fathers. And they've shown a lot of wisdom in the formation of the Constitution. A lot of those provisions that were originally there in 1789 are no longer there. We've changed it. We've amended it. As we've grown as a country, as our needs have changed, we've done that. That's what the amendment is before you today. I urge your support for the amendment to allow for a direct national vote. Thank you.
That concludes the testimony and arguments of today's mock Senate hearing. And the next step is going to be all the senators that are present to cast a vote. And here your vote does count. And we're going to ask you to complete those ballots and turn those in. Before we get to that, though, I do want to thank all of the participants, as well as the Macomb County Bar Foundation, Macomb Community College. This has been an excellent opportunity for the community to hear about a very important topic. So now you may cast your vote.
Okay.
Are we ready for the results? Ladies and gentlemen of the United States Senate, I come to you to announce this historic vote. We here in Warren, Michigan have solved the national crisis. And the results are, for the first clause, to move to a pure popular vote. There were 68 yeas and 48 nays, so the popular vote referendum wins. And for the second clause, although it's a moot point, for the runoff, there are 61 yeas and 48 nays. So the bottom line, though all the participants did an outstanding job, the senators have voted to abolish the Electoral College. And that concludes today's events. Thank you.
Well, Well, I think we had the right side of the issue, so of course we won. Actually, no, I think it was, I think there's a lot of interest in seeing how we can change and modernize the way we elect our presidents and vice presidents in this country, and I think there's a lot of interest in this topic, particularly since 2000 when we've had 2 elections where the person who received the majority of the popular vote was not seated as president of the United States, and I think enough people are starting to recognize that this could become a trend in this country, and we need to determine whether or not we think that's acceptable.
Was there one argument you had that you thought might have won the audience over? Was there one argument more than your other arguments?
Well, I think we were fortunate that our argument is really easy to understand, and that is one person, one vote, that every single vote should count and every single vote should be counted equally. When you're talking about the Electoral College, it becomes very convoluted because that is not the case with the Electoral College. One person's vote in one state could be worth 3.5 times someone else's vote in another state. So for us, it was the simplicity of the message. So we were very fortunate in those regards.